Uh, Welcome, everybody, to today's edition of our National Cyber Seminar Series. My name is Joe Simonetti. I am the Director of Mentorship and Education for the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative at the University of Colorado Anschutz School of Medicine and Anschutz Medical Campus. And this, in our rotating series, we host a variety of speakers who come to present on a broad variety of issues related to firearm violence and the prevention of firearm-related harms nationally. And today, I am really pleased to have two really exciting speakers with us, who I'll introduce really briefly before I just pass things over to them. The first is Nick Buttrick, who is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work focuses on understanding the distinctiveness of American culture, including contemporary American firearm ownership. We also have Tara Warner with us today, who is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and an associate director of UAB's Social Science and Justice Research Pilot Center, leading the Violence Reduction and Prevention Research Corps. As a sociological criminologist, she researches how individuals experience and respond to threats, such as violence and victimization. And currently, she explores how victimization, fears, and group status threats shape firearm-related attitudes and behaviors in the United States. And today in this webinar, they'll be discussing sociological and psychological approaches, decisions about firearm ownership and use, focusing on status-related threats and perceptions about safety. With that, I will finish up. Just a note to sort of our attendees, there is a chat box and a Q&A. So please, as we're going through, I will monitor both of those. We'll probably likely get to questions and answer at the end, but as things come up, please feel free to drop them and we'll make sure that we get to them before the end of the talk. With that, I'll pass it over to Drs. Warner and Buttrick. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, hi. I'd like to extend thanks to Joe for inviting me to participate in this Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative webinar, and to Megan for organizing, and to all of you for joining us. Joe already introduced me, so I can skip that part. My approach to firearms research both investigates and is informed by recent trends and current patterns in U.S. gun ownership. So I want to start out by discussing some of those trends and patterns, and then I'll shift to some of the specific questions that my work examines. So as most, if not all of us here are aware, in 2020, gun buying in the US surged. Data from the most recent wave of the National Firearms Survey estimates that between January 2020 and April 2021, approximately 1.9 million people bought firearms, with purchasing spikes corresponding to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the death of George Floyd, and President Biden's inauguration. Data from the National Opinion Research Center's Amerispeak Omnibus survey in March of 2022 shows that 1 in 5 US households purchased a gun during the pandemic. And running parallel to these increases in gun purchases, firearm-related injuries surpassed motor vehicle crashes to become the leading cause of death among children and adolescents. Now, US gun owners are more demographically diverse than ever. Pandemic first-time buyers were more likely to be women and people of color. For example, women made up almost half of new gun owners after 2019, compared to comprising just over a third of gun owners in prior years. But despite this increased variability in demographic characteristics, pandemic first-time gun buyers are more similar to pre-pandemic owners than they are to non-owners in their support for permissive gun policies, such as allowing more widespread concealed carry and arming teachers. Also, the proportion of US gun owners citing protection as a major reason they own a gun has been increasing, and it's currently higher than it's ever been. Data collected in this past June by the Pew Research Center found 72% of US gun owners cite protection as the reason they own, and 81% of owners say they feel safer owning a gun, with nearly as many saying a gun in the home makes it safer. So how do we reconcile these spikes in gun purchasing, especially purchasing and owning for protection, with the increased risk to individual safety, especially among youth, veterans, older adults, that such firearms present? I would like us to consider a potential problem with protection. First is that studies suggest that firearms owned for protection are less likely to be stored safely. And second, safe storage messaging advocates for storing firearms unloaded, locked, and separate from ammunition when not in use. But for many gun owners who own for protection, that gun is always in use, leading to a fundamental incompatibility between the message and the recipient that may be impenetrable for safety prevention and intervention efforts in messaging. So as a sociological criminologist, my work delves into this idea of protection to argue that we should consider protection not as a singular construct, but rather as a concept that exists along a continuum, where at one end, there are specific, distinct concerns about personal and familial safety, things like fear of crime, prior or anticipated victimization risks. But at the other end are abstract threats and worries, those tied to status, identity, and the comforts of predictability, especially among groups whose place in the social structural framework has historically afforded them considerable stability. From a public health and injury prevention perspective, it seems straightforward to combat distinct fears with facts, focusing on the safety risks presented by firearms, such as emphasizing the increased risk of intentional and unintentional shooting, the decreased chances of defensive gun use. But such facts are likely less effective for addressing abstract status threats, as well as the connections between abstract and distinct threats. So my work asks, when American gun owners say they own for protection, from what are they seeking protection? Or what is it they're trying to protect? I've been exploring these questions using survey data I collected in 2019 via the crowdsourcing platform Amazon Mechanical Turk, and again in early 2023 through a different nationwide survey fielded with the survey firm Lucid. And I explore sources of crime and victimization fears among Americans and how such fears motivate firearm behavior and attitudes. So I'm going to summarize findings across 6 behavioral and attitudinal outcomes. For firearm-related behaviors, I've been exploring protective ownership, firearm accessibility, which I measure as having a loaded gun easily accessible at home all the time, and unsafe firearm storage. For firearm-related attitudes, I explore gun owner identity, which is individuals' indication that being a gun owner is very important to their identity. Attitudes about the safety of guns in the home, the perception that homes with guns are safer than those without. And finally, what I call prospective protective ownership, which is asked among individuals who don't currently own guns, but rather might be open to owning a gun in the future. And if they are open to that, how likely is that to be for protection? And I'm focusing on 3 distinct fears: fear of crime or victimization, perceived risk of victimization, and past victimization experience, as well as 3 abstract threats, including cultural anxiety, racial resentment, and masculine role attitudes. Cultural anxiety captures antagonism towards social and cultural change, and it's measured by statements like the extent to which individuals agree that the American way of life needs to be protected from foreign influence, or America's in danger of losing its identity. These are sentiments that have been captured in work like Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness and Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. These sentiments became focal talking points in the 2016 presidential election, and they remain salient today. These are anxieties that may not reflect a clear, concrete threat to physical safety, but they can be experienced as challenges to the security and stability of one's relative social position. Such perceptions are distressing, spurring feelings of uncertainty, unpredictability, that for some Americans may be managed or mitigated by knowing they have a loaded gun within easy reach. This process is reflected here in the conceptual model guiding my work. So using the anonymous survey data that I've collected to date, I explored first the correlates of crime and victimization fears, finding that fears about victimization are connected to our own personal experiences with physical threat. So having been the victim of a previous crime is certainly associated with being fearful of being victimized in the future. But these fears of victimization are also shaped by broader social and cultural anxieties that are experienced as threats to self and group identity. In terms of the three firearm behaviors, protective ownership, in-home accessibility, and storing firearms unsafely, these are connected to both victimization fears and experiences, as well as cultural anxiety. And in fact, it's often the effect of cultural anxiety that is more substantial than experiences or fears about crime and victimization. For attitudes related to firearms, persons higher in cultural anxiety were more likely to indicate that owning a gun was very important to their identity, and they agreed that guns made homes safer. Even among non-owners, cultural anxiety is associated with openness to owning a gun for protection in the future. So to summarize, protection is the leading motivation for American firearm owners. But what protection means and is motivated by encompasses a range of perceptions and experiences. Motivations, explanations, and rationale for firearm behaviors and attitudes are complex. They are made of both immediate, distinct threats to physical safety, personal safety, family safety, but they're also related to abstract threats that contribute to, if not outright fear, at least some sense of unease or instability or unpredictability that can very reasonably translate into seeking out means for security, stability, control, etc. Further, when we perceive guns as instrumental for reinforcing a sense of control in our environment, our world, our space, it becomes even harder to then see those firearms as potentially dangerous for certain situations, groups, and contexts. That's that fundamental disconnect that I discussed earlier with respect to the problem with protection. We may just be talking about very different things. So through my research exploring protection, I aim to highlight that these anxieties are significant, and it's important to consider them in how we talk about and advocate for gun safety and support for all persons, and also for communities most harmed by gun violence and injury. Thank you.
Nick, I think you might be muted. Nick, I think your audio might be muted. Or is mine?
Sorry, everybody. I was just muttering to myself about how it's really wonderful. You guys can hear me now? Everything's good? Yeah, that I get to go after Tara because the work that I do is really deeply informed by these same sorts of questions, and having somebody else like do all the hard work of like showing the models and laying the groundwork makes my presentation much easier. So I'm also going to start with the same idea that Americans are really likely to say that they own a gun for protection, that it's overwhelmingly the thing that people say when you ask them, why do you have a gun? And it's an answer that's increasing in the population. So the same question asked in 2017, it was only about 2/3 of Americans. We're already up to about 3/4. So not only do Americans tend to think that guns keep them safe, they increasingly believe this. And I think one thing that's definitely worth thinking about in this is that it doesn't have to be this way. That if you survey citizens of other sorts of advanced democracies, you overwhelmingly find that they don't think that guns are the sort of thing that protect. In fact, guns are dangerous. And they sort of look at the American sort of experience as really unusual. So there's nothing inherent to a gun that leads to safety. It's something that we have built up and something that we've constructed. And what you might sort of still be able to say is, well, maybe the Americans are right and everyone else is wrong. And it's probably not exactly right. There's a lot of evidence that guns really are dangerous. That really good meta-analytic work suggests that having a gun in your house makes it a much more dangerous place to be. That when you have a gun, it's much more likely that people in your household die. And this is work which I'm sure that most of you on this call have at least some familiarity with. But of course, even if a gun is dangerous, it still might be a trade-off worth making if it leads to protection in some other way. There's lots of things that we own that are dangerous that we still reasonably think protect us in some other sort of way. Cars, for example, really dangerous, yet most of us are aware of the dangers, at least somewhat, and take those into account when we go about our daily lives. But guns, again, may not be super protective. The survey work that we've seen, and this is not necessarily perfect, but I think it's at least instructive, suggests that it's really, really, really rare for someone to actually use a gun to ward off some sort of violent victimization. And if you think about those situations in which a lot of people imagine themselves as the good guy with a gun, police departments overwhelmingly suggest that if you're in an active shooter situation, you should stay holstered because using a gun in a chaotic environment is something that is really hard to do. It requires a lot of training, a lot of skill. And if you don't have those training, doesn't have that skill, you're much more likely to shoot an innocent bystander or be shot in turn than to actually make the situation better. So guns seem to be dangerous. And yet the overwhelming percentage of gun owners argue otherwise. They see some sort of protection in these weapons. And so this sort of sets up something like a paradox. And it's a paradox that my lab has been really thinking about for a while. And I think one of the things that's nice is that we're psychologists. And so in some sense, it doesn't matter what the actual world says. What really matters is how people understand it and how people think about it. And so the idea that a sense of security is inherently psychological rings really true to us. People believe these things to help them stay safe. And so we have to take them at their word, figure out what is it that they mean when they say that a gun helps to protect them. It's not just an illusion. They really are feeling safer. And so it's sort of incumbent upon us as social scientists to really understand what that cashes out to. And the way that we've been thinking about it, it's another model, which we call the coping model of protective gun ownership. And where it starts for us is if you survey gun owners, especially gun owners who say that guns keep them safe, what you find really often are two linked beliefs. At core, there's the belief that the world is a dangerous place. and that the institutions of society are either unwilling or unable to protect you. So you have a world full of dangers and threats, and the things that would normally protect a person simply aren't there, or are not really able to be sort of brought to bear. And if you have these two beliefs, you should be really questioning fundamental things about your psychological well-being. And so psychologists talk about fundamental needs, the need to feel safe, the need to feel in control, and the need to feel that you're living a meaningful life. And so if you think that you're living in this chaotic world without sort of power to constrain that chaos, you should be really worried about your safety, about your control, and about your meaning. And what we've been increasingly arguing is that protective weapons ownership sort of helps to assuage these fears, helps people to feel safer, to feel more in control, and to feel their lives are more meaningful. That there's something about this object where we've given it the power to sort of help us cope with these really serious threats. Now, this doesn't necessarily come cost-free. And what we think is that protective weapons ownership, especially the American version of it, while it might immediately sort of address these worries about safety, control, and meaning, it actually makes the world seem more dangerous. People report being more vigilant, more on edge when they have their weapons. And it potentially also makes the world seem more uncaring. If you live in a society in which one of the two major political parties is hell-bent on taking your weapon away from you, well, you might be then especially worried that institutions and systems don't care about you. And so you're living in a world full of increasing threat. So by using a gun to address these immediate worries, you might in the long term actually be inadvertently making them worse. So that's a model. It's easy to put boxes and arrows up. And so one of the things we've been really looking at is, well, what does this look like in the world, right? How do we understand the actual lived experience of gun owners? And how do we watch them sort of use their guns to cope with threat and cope with stress? And so what we did is we ran a quick experiment. So we asked a sampling firm to get us a nationally representative sample of both gun owners and non-gun owners. And of our gun owners, we looked for people who reported regularly carrying a weapon. So these are people who really do rely on their guns to feel safe. And what we did is we just sent them a huge amount of text messages. So across a 2-week period, we sent them messages 3 times a day. And essentially we just asked them, hey, what are you doing right now? Where are you? How are you feeling? And this gives us a pretty decent sense of what the tenor of their days actually look like. Now, we did this at a very special time, which is we sent these all out in April 2020. So if you think back to April 2020, that's the early COVID lockdowns. It was a really stressful time. We sort of had no idea what was happening with COVID. We sort of had no idea what was happening with the future. And we were all really, 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 really worried. So it's a time of really heightened threat. And so what we did when we sent these text messages out was we asked them questions about their worldview. So essentially, how much do you currently feel like you have meaning in life, right? You feel like you matter, you feel like you have a purpose. How vigilant are you right now? Are you worried about being victimized? We also asked about their assessment of their current situation. In the thing that you're doing right now at this moment, how chaotic is it? How unexpected? How threatening? And how nice is it? How relaxing, fun, interesting? You sort of enjoying yourself. And then we asked them questions about how they were feeling. Are you currently feeling anxious, angry, lonely? Are you feeling safe? Are you feeling in control? Now, these all formed composites which happen to have pretty good reliability across both people and across time. So we feel pretty confident that we're indexing proper psychological traits with these measures. And so what we did is we had 3 groups in our study. One, we had a bunch of non-owners. So these are people who do not own guns, have never owned guns. And then we had the group that we recruited that were gun-owning people. Within our gun owners, we built a little study in, an experiment. So what we did is we split our group up and we randomly assigned one group of these gun owners to answer 2 questions before they answered the rest of the text message. We asked them, hey, do you have your gun with you? And if so, yes. And if not so, why? So essentially why? So do you have your gun with you, yes or no? And then why do you have your gun with you or not have your gun with you? So we just wanted to make them think about their weapon before responding to the rest of the survey. And then for our non-reminded owners, we never asked them about their gun. They had the exact same survey as our non-owners. So we have a random assignment here where we are testing whether or not thinking about one's gun happens to have sort of coping power as opposed to not thinking about it. And then within our reminded owners, luckily enough, we can then look at the pings at which they are carrying their weapons and the pings at which they report not carrying their weapons. So this isn't showing up right now, so this can go forward and then, oh, it should be showing up. Anyway, back. What we found essentially is that half of the pings, people reported that they had their gun with them. And for half the pings, they reported they didn't have their gun with them. So what we can then do is, within looking just at the group of people who were reminded about their weapons, what does the world look like when they are carrying their weapon versus when they're not? And so what we can do is start to take this model and see how it plays out in the world. So by looking at the comparison between those gun owners who we reminded about their weapon versus those who we did not remind, we can look to see, does thinking about your weapon sort of help you feel safer, more in control, and that your life is more meaningful? And unsurprisingly, because I'm telling you about this, we found that it did. So those gun owners who were randomly assigned to think about their gun beforehand reported feeling more safe and more in control than those who we didn't remind, which is what that red box is showing. And they're both feeling more safe than our non-owners. And similarly, we find that thinking about one's gun then makes one's life feel more meaningful. So they report that their life is more meaningful after they have thought about their weapon, as opposed to those people who weren't. And what we can then also do is, within those people who we reminded about their weapon, look to see the other part of our model. Does the world look more dangerous when you have your gun with you versus when you don't? And so what we find is that within subjects analysis, so these are the same people who sometimes have their gun and sometimes they don't. We find that when they have their gun, they report being more vigilant. They report that the current situation that they're in is more chaotic. They feel more anxious, and they don't feel any safer. So they're not necessarily getting all the benefits of their weapon in the moment. Now, of course, it could be that this kind of pattern would happen for two different reasons. On the one hand, a gun might change the way that people see how the world looks, and maybe it's all perceptual, that a gun is sort of acting as a maladaptive coping mechanism. It may also be that when you have a gun, you put yourself in more dangerous situations, right? You actually are legitimately in a more chaotic, more anxious place because your gun is sort of giving you the strength to try stuff you wouldn't otherwise try. And we can sort of look at this a little bit because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, these were studies that we ran at the very beginning of the COVID lockdowns. And if you remember, at the very beginning of the COVID lockdowns, nobody was really going anywhere. We were mostly just sitting at home. And what we then did is we went back through these surveys and we looked at what people said that they were doing when we pinged them. And overwhelmingly, the thing that they said they were doing was watching television. That was far and away the most common experience. And the experience of watching television is usually pretty similar, regardless of what else is going on. You're sitting on a couch at home, staring at the same screen. And so what we can then do to sort of get a sense of the situational question is look just at these moments when people report watching television. So if we keep the situation constant, watching TV, does the world look different when you have a gun versus not? And what we find is pretty much the same pattern. So if you just look at TV watching, you hold the situation constant, the same people report being more vigilant, seeing the situation as more chaotic, feeling more anxious, and not feeling any safer when they have their gun versus not. And so to sort of summarize, what we're finding in this experience sampling study, when we actually try to get a peek into the lives of these American gun owners, when we remind them of their gun, they feel safer, more in control, and that their lives are more meaningful. But when they're actually carrying their weapon, it seems as if the immediate situation looks more dangerous, even when we hold the situation essentially constant. And so what this sort of tells us is just sort of piggybacking on what Tara was saying earlier, that guns play a very specific role, we think, in the lives of a lot of their owners. And to sort of elide that, to sort of look past that, risks missing out on some really important levers and barriers towards intervention. That if you aren't taking into account the ways in which guns help people to feel safe and the sorts of threats against which they're protecting, when you're trying certain kinds of messaging, you may just be speaking a different language and sort of speaking past the people to whom you're trying to communicate. And so taking the psychological and sociological approach of actually understanding what it is that the gun is doing for somebody may be a really important step in building interventions that actually meet people where they are and have a better chance at actually changing behavior, changing attributions to the safer. Yeah, so that's all I've got. And I think we're ready to take questions.
Thank you both for those awesome presentations. For anybody here, you can add questions in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get to those. And I sort of love this topic because I've been thinking for a long while on it. I haven't done any work in it, so that's why we invited you here today. But Dr. Warner, you were talking about this idea of prospective protective ownership. I kind of wrote it down so I would remember the phrase. And that's super fascinating. So I remember back in like 2015, there was the National Firearm Survey and then the Pew Survey. And they both came out with sort of these similar estimates of gun ownership and household gun ownership prevalence. And of sort of the third of American adults who identified as gun owners, there were another like third who said they could see themselves becoming gun owners in the future. And that was 2015. So that was before a fairly tumultuous brief period in American history, which we're probably still sitting in the middle of. And I'm just curious, is there anything out there about sort of stated versus revealed preferences? Like, what do you think is like the probability of these folks actually becoming gun owners? And are there any interventions or are there any thinking out there about how you provide information to individuals sort of in that contemplative phase to help them make informed decisions about that decision?
That's a really great question, Joe. And the question that I used in my survey was modeled directly off of that Pew survey about how likely are you to own a gun in the future. Mm-hmm. And I was really curious about that measure because it's so difficult to assess kind of the temporality between our motivations and gun purchases. So thinking about someone who hasn't purchased but might is kind of a way to get at that. I think my estimates mapped on a little bit to the Pew estimates in terms of how many non-owners said that they could see themselves owning in the future. And the question about, has anyone thought about how to intervene there? I think it's untapped. It's certainly uncharted territory, and that would be a really interesting space in which to interject. And it makes me also think about the recent research about new gun owners and that these folks look different in some ways and not in others. And so how we intervene and message and communicate risks to new gun owners could be similar to how we might want to think about intervening with those who are at some potential contemplative stage. Where that would actually look in practice is a great question, and I'm not sure. Yeah.
It's interesting if you think about it sort of like stages of change or stages of decision making. You've got this sort of pre-contemplative firearm ownership group out there. And theoretically, based on what we know from other health behaviors, we should be applying different communication strategies or psychological strategies to influence their thinking on things. But I don't know if we spent a whole lot of time about that. And if sort of your hypotheses in early work are correct, that the information out there that scares people is likely to drive them into gun buying and gun ownership, then we're probably applying the wrong types of pressure, I think.
Yeah.
I think just to jump in on that, I think, the question is, for this pre-contemplative group, like, what do they see in a gun, right? What is the lack that they're trying to fill? And, if some of the models that we've been talking about are right, that it might be something as sort of left field as, in order to get people to think about this, actually thinking about like, how good is your government? right? Like, how able are your police? How good is your civic society? And that it might be much more in terms of civic engagement type approaches, to sort of get people to think more clearly about the risks and the benefits of what it is that they'd be doing with bringing a gun in. Right? If they're bringing a gun into their house because they don't trust the police, that's a very different sort of approach than if they're bringing a gun in for some other kind of reason. And so thinking about the context in which they're embedded may be really important in that sort of pre-contemplative stage. Yeah.
And one of the really common messages that you see is that law enforcement can't protect you. And it's either through explicit reference to situations in which law enforcement wasn't protective, or it's to reference to sort of objective measures of response time, right? So even if the police are 7 minutes away, 7 minutes is too long. So that's probably fairly powerful information for some folks.
Yeah.
How much of this is, I work in clinical medicine, and I work really specifically in suicide prevention a lot of the time. And what we hear from folks, and not just sort of in the VA where I do my clinical work, but all over the place, is that I don't think this is ever going to happen to me. That's not a rule, but very commonly we hear, the suicide event isn't going to happen to me. I would never do that. Or if I were to do it, I would never use a firearm. I don't buckle my seatbelt because of this reason. And so some of this is sort of maybe weighting or overweighting the extent to which a gun keeps one safe. How much of this is the other side of the equation in which, individuals really don't believe the risk side of the equation?
Do you want to jump on that one, Nick? I know that corresponds with a little bit of what we've been trying to explore in some work moving forward. I think that's a spot on take that, and I know in some of the work that I've been reading about safe storage messaging for parents, that there's, what parents think their kids are going to do is totally out of step with what kids report doing. So I think there is definitely a big overestimation of, how unlikely it is to happen to you.
Yeah.
I think at the same time, we think about motivated cognition in psychology, this idea that you're sort of trying to skew numbers, skew facts, skew the way that you see the world in order to help you feel good. And I think when it comes to trying to assess the risk of anything, if there's a thing that you like, you're going to downplay those risks. That's just sort of very natural human behavior, that if there's something that is a core part of your identity, something that you're really attached to, you're going to look for ways of making it seem less bad. And so when it comes to these things about, I don't think the gun is particularly dangerous. I don't think, anybody would commit suicide with a gun. I don't know to what extent those are numbers that are movable in a way. I think people might say it for sure. I'm not sure how much they truly believe it, but I think it's not exactly separate from this idea of how good a gun is. It's like essentially this other side of the same coin. That to the extent that somebody is really enamored of their gun, that they really do believe that's going to protect them, it's almost, I suspect, automatic that they're going to think that it's not a particularly dangerous object. Because to believe it to be dangerous would threaten the idea that it actually can help protect you. And so if you're really attached to protection, you've got to do a little bit of work to make it seem better at protecting you and less not good at protecting you.
I sort of think about this in sort of a context of behavioral economics, where we're really bad at estimating risk. And at the same time, and like if you look at sort of the heuristics literature, the things that happen recently that stick in our minds, the stuff on the news, like the legitimate newsworthy episodes of where individuals defend themselves with firearms and do so successfully, and that stuff just anchors in individuals' brains. And the equation is extremely fraught when it comes to like validating their own risk.
I think just jumping up that really quickly,
go.
You see probably way more people who commit suicide with a gun as opposed to somebody who like is heroically, saving their family with a gun. And if it was just about looking at the world and seeing the most recent thing and sort of using that to anchor your risk assessment, you'd expect to see a world that believes that guns are much more dangerous than they are. And so I think it's not just that we're bad at assessing risk, is that we have a motivation to look for certain kind of exemplars when we're telling the story. And so, if you want to believe a gun is safe, you're going to look for the most recent time when someone used a gun to be safe. And you're going to sort of downplay all of the other examples of places where a gun was actually dangerous. And so it's even worse than sort of a classic behavioral economics approach might imagine, because you're not just picking stuff out of the world, you're looking for certain kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then when you find them, you sort of believe that you've sort of done a good sampling.
Yeah. Nick, do you have like one of the only few data sets in existence about firearm behaviors during the opening months of the COVID pandemic? I can't imagine that, given what that protocol must have looked like, that you had framed it around the context of COVID, I'm assuming.
Yeah, no, we got, you could say lucky, you could say unlucky, that, we had been planning on running that study for a while, and we'd actually run into some slow moving IRBs. And then by the time that they approved it, it was like, surprise, guess what? No one's going anywhere. And so, and then, we got very excited because this was a time when doing science seemed hard. And so finding a way to do it where we could all be distant, we didn't have to bring anybody into a lab, we didn't have to sort of, interact with our participants face to face, was a minor godsend. And then,
how much does it question whether, I mean, does it raise you to question whether some of your findings are kind of period and context specific? I mean, I guess that's always the potential, but when I think about some of the measures you used about sort of chaos and control and comfort and anxiety, it's hard for me to, subtract how I might respond to a measure related to that in April 2020 than had I might respond to the same measure on my couch watching television in January 2020. Do you have to do the study again?
If someone wants to give us money to do it, we'd be happy to. I think, we've run other studies, both before and since, which sort of ask some of these same kind of questions. The most interesting one, I think, is one that we ran pre-pandemic, where we tried to sort of do a much better job of experimental control. So we brought people into the lab for this one. So we didn't actually just survey them in everyday life. And what we did is we threatened them. So we hooked them up to a shock generator, and nobody likes being shocked. It's threatening. And we measured their heart rate, as essentially we're like, hey, in the next 10 seconds, you might get a shock. And so that sends people's heart rates skyrocketing. And while we were doing this to people, we also gave them a gun to hold. So in one condition, they were holding a very realistic fake pistol. In one condition, they were holding a just random metal object that's about the same weight. And in one condition, they're actually holding a friend's hand, because that actually has been shown to be palliative. And so in this case, we can look at when someone's actually being threatened, how does having access to a weapon sort of make you feel? And so this is again pre-pandemic, so we don't have to worry about, the worries about, viral load or whatever. And what we find essentially is that for people who grew up in gun owning households, people who are comfortable, familiar with guns, holding on to a gun actually made them feel better when threatened with shock. They felt their heart rate was a lot slower. They reported feeling sort of just better about the world. When we looked at the people who didn't grow up in gun owning households, when they're holding a gun, they actually feel a lot more scared, right? Holding a gun and also being shocked is sort of double threat. And so this idea that guns help you to feel safe in the face of threat, we can at least show it in the lab when we're dealing with these very artificial sorts of threats and stressors. And so we think that, it should be at least somewhat trans-pandemic, that these things still play psychologically in a similar kind of way.
It's fascinating. We can still shock people. Kara, one question as we're finishing up. Your work on identity, right? And like the relationship between firearm use behaviors and sort of identity threat, I think is really fascinating. Where is this all going? I mean, I think in the last few years, my sense is that identity, particularly social and political identity, are becoming more entrenched or maybe more divided or so. And so what does that mean for the next 10 years of firearm acquisition and use in the US?
I think that's a really important question. The kind of, what do we do with this, given the role of identity in shaping our firearm behaviors and firearm attitudes? And that's really what's driving me to unpack protection and collaborate with Nick on understanding what guns mean for individuals and what component of identity are individuals trying to reinforce. I think continued attention to refining messaging is really important, and finding the script that is most salient to a given group or in response to a given threat. I've been really interested in some recent work, I think out of political science, talking about sort of this balance between facts and making it real. And when we're dealing with contentious issues, that when individuals are presented with sort of a real world story. So if you are presenting a real world story of an unintentional shooting, an injury, then that seems to move the needle a bit more than presenting facts. So I think that we still have a lot to do to figure out the right messaging that balances without alienating the identities, because we aren't going to change the identity politics, or we aren't going to be able to address the threats that individuals are experiencing or how they're responding to those threats. We can't reassure someone that no one's coming to take their job or anything like that. But if we can find the right message strategy to convey to them, there are safer practices that you can engage in, then I think that's our best strategy for responding to continued trends and purchasing.
Yeah, and if I could jump off that, there's some really interesting anthropological work that looks at the ways in which gun owners think about how they would respond in a sort of a dangerous situation, sort of what they would do. And a lot of them are sort of relying on these, I don't want to say Hollywood fantasies, that seems a little pejorative, but they aren't thinking about the worst case scenarios. They're thinking about all of the ways in which they're going to be great. And they really radically overestimate their efficacy in these sorts of situations. And so, something that, brings people back in line with the reality of how hard it is to act with a gun may be a really powerful approach. Because you don't have to, right? Most gun owners never have to test themselves against the threats that they're imagining. They can sort of live in a world in which it always goes really well. And that's great, right? We don't want people having to, fend off mass shooters every day. That would be a much worse world than the world we live in. But when you look at those experiences when there is a mass shooting, and sometimes you interview the people who were there, who were armed, what some of that work looks like is they realize how difficult it would have been to have done something. And it's sort of a bit more realigning of sort of what it means for them to be able to be effective in these situations. And when you realize it's a lot harder than you think it is, it may potentially make a gun seem less effective, a tool of protection, which then opens it up for the reassessment of the risks and benefits of having it in your house.
Yeah, there are practical downsides to intervening. There's also, cognitive and emotional downsides to intervening with a firearm. And, I can't tell you how many veterans I've worked with in clinical practice who have, World War II, Vietnam, killed individuals in combat, which, that's as self-defense as it gets, and have struggled with it for decades and decades and decades. And so if that's the emotional cost for some individuals of intervening in a combat zone, what does it mean to intervene in the midst of a property crime, right? And if I think folks understood that side of the equation, that might impact some behaviors as well. All right. Well, I want to thank you both for being here and for this conversation. I think this topic is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's sort of really one of the most fundamental issues in the question about firearm injury prevention nationally. And so I'm really delighted that you're doing this work, and I hope to have you back on the seminar when you have some updates for us with your work.
Yeah, we'd love to be back. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody have a nice day.